You may have seen this book before. It's probably on the best-selling column in your local bookstore. You may have even heard the author's story, Tara Westover. But what is this book about? Should you read it? I'm going to try and answer that for you in this video. Here's my story about why I read this book. So I was actually in China, and I was trying to find a book in China that explained the history of China. And I went to every single bookstore, and it turns out that finding an English book in China is very, very difficult. Most of the books are obviously in Chinese, so finding one that was in English was difficult, and then finding one that was on Chinese history in English was pretty much impossible. I found one book in one bookstore, which was just about the Silk Road, so that was as good as I got. But every time I kept going to a different bookstore in China, I kept seeing this same book, Educated, in every single best-selling shelf. So I thought, this looks interesting. This looks like a book that Chinese people like. I should give it a read. And when I saw the cover of the book, it was in obviously Chinese characters because it's in China. But I assumed that this was going to be a book about, somebody from China. Maybe it was going to be about a, typical, Chinese immigrant maybe, but this couldn't be further from that. Yeah, so I thought this was going to be about the Gaokao or something, or just, Chinese people obviously value education. So I thought this was going to be somewhat related to that. But then I started reading this book, and all of a sudden, I hear about Mormons and Idaho, and I was like, what? I totally judged the book by its cover, but, what kept me around was just, amusing myself at the characters in the book, and realizing that sometimes common sense is just common for a reason. Yeah, so we learn pretty much in the book at the start of the first chapter, who Tara is, the main character. She lives in regional Idaho, a place called Bucks Peak. She lives in a family that's devout. They're devout Mormons, and they're also what's called survivalist Mormons. So they're constantly always preparing for the end of the world. So everything that they get in surplus, they end up putting in a basement, so that when the end times come about, they'll be ready. The title of the book, does make sense, but essentially, in the first few chapters, Tara's upbringing is essentially the opposite of being educated. She's isolated and she's brainwashed. She really lives in this, fantasy world constructed by her parents, and she doesn't really understand why things are working the way they are, and everything is always just divine intervention, or because God said so. So without spoiling too much in the book, you can understand that when you live with a family like that, things are naturally going to go wrong. This is the type of family that's not going to follow regular safety precautions. This is not the type of family that's going to believe in modern medicine, and so you can imagine the things that might happen to the family if somebody got injured. All this to say that Tara's upbringing was anything but normal, and eventually Tara does find an educational facility. I won't say what school it is, but she finds an educational facility, and it turns out that Tara is actually quite smart and with it, and she excels and thrives in that academic environment. The other crazy thing about this book was that I thought it was a fiction book. I thought, reading most of the chapters through, I thought this was going to naturally, some of the stories that were being told that were hilarious and what have you, and dramatic. I thought that was natural because this was a fiction book, but it turns out, as I kind of got deeper into the book, it's actually a memoir. It's an account of Tara's account of her own life, which is even more crazy. And it's interesting to me because if you've read anything by Sylvia Plath, you'll know that Sylvia Plath's poetry is pretty much autobiographical, it's autobiographical in a way. And when I remember studying Sylvia Plath in English class, and I used to pretty much say everything that Sylvia Plath does in her poetry is about her, and it's autobiographical. This is why she says the things she does. And I remember an English teacher saying to me that you don't have to necessarily assume that it's autobiographical. In the poem, Sylvia Plath, yes, she's speaking on behalf of herself, but don't just think about it as it's just Sylvia Plath. Like, she represents, particularly any woman could put herself in Sylvia Plath's position, or any person in particular. Like, the character in the poem is not just Sylvia Plath. That would be a wrong interpretation to have, because it kind of robs the poetry of its kind of general, broader message to the wider public. And in the same way, I feel like even though Tara's story is an autobiography rather than, just a fictional story that can apply to anyone, I still find merit in interpreting this book as its own kind of general story rather than, Tara's specific story. To me, this was a book about, there are lots of takeaways from this book. One of my personal takeaways from this book was essentially the importance of our public institutions. So I think it's really easy as a citizen of the world or the citizen of your country to be really angry at how inefficient government infrastructure can be. So, for example, hospitals oftentimes don't get the care they need. Schools often don't get the right funding, or they don't teach the right programs, or they're not taught in a certain way that kind of is inefficient. And, sometimes safety precautions can be so over the top and so cumbersome that it can be very frustrating. And I think reading this book was a good step back, from all those frustrations that I personally have with government institutions. I think it really made me reflect on, as inefficient as some government institutions can be, we absolutely need them as part of our foundation for society. Public schooling is absolutely essential if we need a society, to have kind of basic fundamental knowledge of, why you should wear seatbelts, why you should go to a doctor instead of trying to attempt to try and save someone yourself, why you should call an ambulance, why you should why you should learn to read and write, why not just you, but everyone should learn to read and write to benefit the greater society so that everyone's lives improves, including yours. Particularly because of recent times, it's easy to be distrusting of the government, but I really do think that for the greater good, it's really great that we have these things in place. And if you read the book, I think you kind of know what I mean. Yeah, I do think this book is worth reading, and I do think Tara's story is believable because of how well she writes. So Tara is, honestly, when it comes to authors, she's probably on the higher end of how well she writes the story. Like, she's able to really convey complex ideas, but translate it in a comprehensible way. And in particular, what I'm thinking of is like that feeling of, and you'll understand this if you are part of a family as well, but if you have potentially a higher level of education than your parents, it does, you might know more about a subject than your parents, but if your parents, still assume that they're correct about something that you've studied about, even because they're still your parents, you still feel this need to think that their opinion is the true opinion rather than the one that you've studied in school. I feel like that I've experienced that before, and I feel like Tara really did a really good job of explaining that in her story. And it just goes to show that it's believable that she did so well academically because her writing style is one of the best I've ever read. I think Tara's family is kind of the perfect metaphor of, translating this story. So, you have Tara's family that just bumble about, and every time something bad happens to them, it's this confirmation of bias of, that's even though they get proven wrong, they think they're right, and then it kind of delves further and further into this like stupidity, and which just causes even further accidents, further things to go wrong. And it kind of makes me reflect on myself, like what things do I only use my own anecdotal experience for? What things haven't I read about that maybe I'm totally misinterpreting in the wrong way? How are we a bit like the Mormon families? And in particular, like kind of the survivalism, the end of the world stuff. Like, I think it's really easy to think that the world is going to end constantly, but it's one of the most awful ways to live life, is to constantly think that the world is going to end. And we really don't have any proof of that besides climate change. All right, just a little quick spoiler section. If you've read this, skip to maybe the last 10 seconds of this video. You can probably click off now. But I just thought that the junkyard section was always the most horrifying section in the entire book. I thought the junkyard was what I'm trying to get at, what I've been trying to talk about in this video is the junkyard is, to me, the perfect metaphor for like what, uncertain, uneducated world that Tara lives in with her family, and how things constantly go wrong. There's no safety precautions. People get injured, people die, people don't die. But people get gruesomely injured, and it's not good. It's not good. So I just thought Tara did a really good job of creating a sense of suspense every time we were in the junkyard, because you just knew something was going to go wrong. And when something did go wrong, you thought, okay, well, they'll learn their lesson, and then they didn't. And that is really frustrating as a reader, but also I think kind of sells the point. So I guess the other thing we could talk about with Tara was how believable is her story. So after I finished the book, I kind of looked up what other people thought about the book. And one thing that I noticed that other people noticed as well is that, yes, spoilers, Tara ends up going to Cambridge and Harvard as well, because she's so smart and so talented. And I just feel like the logistics of her family being able to fly her to England and all that seem a little bit weird and not quite right. I guess maybe that's covered by the scholarship, but I just thought that was a little crazy how she was able to even maneuver that. So, but I mean, the story, I guess, is obviously true. It's funny because then there's some people who think that the family's not so crazy as Tara makes them out to be, but I kind of honestly, I probably take Tara's opinion over the families, because apparently you can Google them in real life. They do exist. Their medicine shop is real. But yeah, look, I just don't buy the family story. I think I'm probably in Tara's camp on this one, but it's really up to you what position you take on that one. So all right. Thank you for listening to my ramblings about this book. But yeah, ultimately, I think it does make me think about ways in which I might identify with that, with the Westovers, and always keep in mind that education is very important. It really is, and you never should really be closed to education. So I thought it was a great book. Thanks.